2 years ago, I had the privilege of working at a company called Gitlab, pre-IPO, and then while I was there, the company IPO'd. Gitlab is a remote-first company where when I joined, part of their handbook, which is public and you can see it online, said that there was no meetings that you had to attend. And I didn't think this was possible. How could this be? In the corporate world or business world, you had to show up to every meeting, and your schedule is plagued by hours of blocks of meetings where you question, are these productive? Is this the way kind of the world works? But you just have to sit through them and deal with it. But when I joined GitLab, it was a really refreshing perspective on how to be productive and improving your asynchronous or non-synchronous communication across teams. With a company like GitLab, being remote first is crucial because you work on teams across multiple time zones. So having meetings is pretty laborious and takes a lot of coordination. So what they decided to do is say you can still have meetings, but this is the process, and we recommend that this is how you approach communication so you don't have to attend meetings. And if there's a meeting at 5 a.m. and you don't need to attend, you don't have to. So here are the two main points of how they made this possible. The most important point is documentation. And there's a lot of nuances when it comes to documentation, but what GitLab found was that there needed to be a single source of truth or single place where all engineers, product management, customers go to get information. And if it's not there, it's your responsibility to contribute back. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's difficult to execute, especially across thousands of people across hundreds of time zones. And what I've kind of distilled this down to is be more of kind of a cultural thing, that it's an expectation inside of a company that this is how we do things. Because when it's not a cultural expectation within the company, it's pretty hard to convince someone to start doing something, especially when the company or the entity has been moving this way for a long period of time. It's so daunting to get back up to speed to get to that point where documentation can actually be an effective tool in your business. How you technically approach documentation is also super important. I have a ton of data points on this, and I've noticed that when people try and do documentation, they put it in Google Docs or Confluence or Jira, which is great. I think some documentation is better than no documentation. But what I have noticed is that people tend to trust documentation more when it's under version control through GitHub, GitLab, as opposed to not. For example, if I want to add documentation to my business, this is our onboarding process for hiring. And if I just add that to a Google Doc, people seem to trust that less than if I were to open a pull request on a GitHub Pages repo. That's like, this is our new onboarding process. And then you have approvals of people that say, like, the boss that's like, okay, that's correct. So then when they go to that page, they go, oh, I take this to be true. I'm not entirely sure why, but it's just a data point that I've noticed, and something that you might want to apply to your organization. Something that you could do is just go to GitHub, get an account, GitHub Pages, and then it's pretty simple to learn. I can do a video on that, but I wanted to make an important distinction between version controlled and non-version controlled documentation inside of an organization, especially when you have more than 5 people contributing to it at once. I briefly mentioned this, but one of the most important things is that as a unit, if you recognize something is out of date, you make the effort to put what you're doing aside to fix that documentation for the team. And it's a collaborative, it's a different way of thinking because that is not directly tied to your output of work you're doing, but as a collective, it moves the unit much faster. So it's kind of like anything worth doing, right? If you are in a caloric deficit for a long enough period of time, you're going to lose weight. if you work out every day, you're going to get stronger. You don't want to do it, but you know that the small actions you take towards the goal will result in the result. It will result in the goal you want to achieve. And this is no different. It's short-term pain for long-term gain. So that's something that you need to be okay driving. Your team needs to be on board with, and you have to explain the benefit of it. And you might not see the benefit for a couple months, but it's something that you kind of need to keep doing to see that benefit. Something that was crucial, especially on an engineering perspective, was that the documentation that the engineers and product managers used was the same documentation that the customers used to validate that the product was either working correctly or not working correctly. And all of this is on GitLab. You can Google GitLab's handbook and check this out. And what that did was just allow for everyone to be on the same page constantly, where an engineer doesn't have to go ask a product manager, is this the way the feature is supposed to work? It's like, if it's not working the way the documentation says it, one of two things are happening. The product is broken or the documentation is wrong, and then you figure out which one it is and then move forward. So there's a really long point one. So point one, to recap, documentation. And there's a lot of nuances that have to go with documentation. Point two is personal accountability and responsibility, and that ties into documentation, but as it relates to meetings specifically. And what I mean by that is there are a few housekeeping things that keep meetings so that if people can't show up, it's still productive. One of those things is that the meeting is always recorded. Another one of those things is an agenda is always set up beforehand. So if me and you have a meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m., we both put in our agenda items, or else the meeting doesn't happen and it's canceled. Another thing is, if there are more than two people on the meeting, someone self-volunteers, back to our accountability, that they will be the note taker in the meeting, so that not only is it recorded, but someone is live kind of translating or making key points, so that if I don't want to watch the entire recording, now with AI tools, stuff like that, it might be less of an issue, but I can just quickly look at the agenda and pull pieces I need to out and comment back to them. So this document is just a Google Doc that's living, associated with the meeting. I'm a huge believer in constraints creating creativity. So they also, in their handbook for asynchronous communication in GitLab, they recommend that you have speedy meetings, which is like a Google setting, I believe, in Google Calendar, that meeting times are 15 minutes, 25 minutes, and 50 minutes, which enforce this upfront productivity or this upfront accountability and not wasting anyone's time is crucial. So by constraining the time of the meeting, it forces us to question, do we even need this meeting? And let's make the most out of it. So to recap, the two main points that you can take away from how to run, this is how a multi-billion-dollar company runs a company without requiring meetings. Point one, documentation, single source of truth, under version control. And two, accountability and questioning, do we need these meetings to happen? And making sure there's an infrastructure and process in place so that the meetings are productive and can be accessed by anyone. Now, just because no meetings were required doesn't mean that we didn't have meetings. It meant that the importance of attending the meeting was secondary to productivity, which I think is a very important distinction, because I could make the call with my manager. We have one-on-ones, and I'd say, would you like the time back? I'd like to work on this to be more productive. And I would add information to my document, and we would communicate asynchronously offline. So it's less about binary meeting, no meeting, and more about questioning the value of the meeting and adjusting and leaning more towards productivity, because life gets in the way. You have kids, you have to go do stuff. We chose productivity over meetings, and that forced us to work more on documentation, work more asynchronously, have that accountability and stuff like that. And my last bonus point to this is I think this was all made easier by a product that we dog fooded, which means we used every day to build the product. For example, if you work on Gmail or Google, you're probably going to use Gmail as your email to communicate with your other team, not Microsoft Outlook. So dog fooding your product doesn't have to be such a crazy, you use GitLab to build GitLab. Enforcing dog fooding in the organization does help support these other 2 points because it's just always in your face. And then when you're constantly getting feedback from the product, improving documentation, questioning meetings, and communicating asynchronously becomes easier because everyone is getting feedback in their own way and can question the status quo and move the ball forward. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please check out somewhere over here 4 hard lessons from Alex Hermosu's $1 Million Software Fail, where I break down essentially how to de-risk your software business from a technical perspective as a software engineer in Silicon Valley.